This is the Saturn V rocket that took humans to the moon. It consumed over 12,000 kilograms of propellant each and every second during its first stage burn. It was so thirsty, it burned through over 125,000 kilograms of propellant before it even cleared the launch tower. Imagine if they could have just saved that propellant for the end of the burn or removed it completely. Wouldn't that mean massive gains in payload capacity? Can't we build a better launch system? In the world of why don't they just ideas, there's one that's perhaps most tantalizing. Why don't they just use a vacuum tunnel maglev catapult or something to push the rocket off the ground so you don't need as big and powerful of a rocket? It seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, and today we're going to dive into the art of rocket yeeting, or using some kind of ground-based launch assist system to help make orbital rockets more efficient. We'll go over the physics, the challenges, the practicality, and all the math on a few ideas, including just adding launch assist systems to existing rockets and infrastructure, what it would look like to actually replace a rocket altogether with some kind of yeeting device, and we'll even look into one idea where this could be the most game-changing. And hopefully by the end of this video, we'll know why some kind of ground-based launch assist system isn't far more common, or common at all, or perhaps why it's not the most common way of launching an orbital rocket. Okay, let's get started. Okay, right at the top here, we do have two things to go over really quick. First, we finally have our next 1/100 scale model rockets finally available in our shop. Our Falcon 9 was our first, metal 1/100 scale model rocket. And now we're going back to the beginning of human spaceflight, at least in the United States for now, with the Mercury program rockets. They're in stock now, as well as we finally have a new run of our Falcon 9s in stock at everydayastronaut.com/shop. Get them now and start your very own rocket garden. Okay, next I have to strongly suggest watching some previous videos, including orbit versus suborbit, why not launch from mountains and or the equator, and why not launch from jets, because they lay down a lot of important groundwork that are vital concepts for this video. Okay, so assuming you've seen those videos or you're familiar with these concepts, or maybe you've just played a good amount of Kerbal Space Program, I think that means you're fully qualified to dive into the topic of throwing a rocket. So, why don't they just? Assisting a rocket with a ground-based launch system certainly isn't a novel idea, and it's been seen in many concepts, going back as far as rocketry itself. Actually, it kind of goes back before modern rockets were even made. I mean, one of the very first films ever made, Le Voyage dans la Lune, depicted humans being shot to the moon via a giant cannon. And for some reason, those humans brought their umbrellas with them to the moon, and the moon had like a weird face, and it's all just so weird. But anyway, the point is, this is far from a new idea. This particular concept kind of came to life in the 1950s with a project called HARP, the High Altitude Research Project. It was a 36-meter long cannon that could shoot a 41-centimeter wide projectile 180 kilometers in altitude, officially making it a valid way to yeet an object into space. But it has some limitations. First, with only a single impulse, an object can go up to space, but it can't be put into orbit because it will always come back around to its lowest point. Which means an object shot from a cannon from the ground will always hit the atmosphere and then the ground at some point, even if it had a high enough velocity to achieve orbit. Second, it's difficult to make sensitive electronics, not to mention living creatures, survive virtually instantaneously accelerating from 0 to almost 8,000 kilometers an hour in 0.03 of a second, pulling about 7,500 Gs. So could we even realistically use a ground-throwing device for an orbital rocket? Well, fast forward to now, and a company called Spin Launch is actually working on an orbital launch system that, instead of shooting a rocket out of a cannon, spins a rocket with a centrifuge inside of a vacuum chamber and then chucks it out fast enough to basically replace the booster of a rocket. Their goal is to build a small liquid propellant rocket that could take about 200 kilograms to orbit. So this orbital rocket wouldn't even need a booster. Just imagine not having to build the largest and most expensive part of a rocket, the booster, and instead of using rocket fuel, they're using electric motors and electrical energy to spin up the rocket. So it has the potential to be very reusable, reliable, and a very sustainable system. This sounds promising, doesn't it? To date, they've completed a 33-meter wide, 1/3 scale demonstrator that has launched 10 passive projectiles, reaching almost 10 kilometers in altitude. but things get a little more wild when this gets fully scaled up. The 100-meter wide full-scale orbital version would spin up to 450 RPM over an hour and a half, which would put about 10,000 Gs on the rocket while it's inside the centrifuge. And that might not be the biggest challenge they face. Then they also have to precisely time the release of the rocket and the opening and closing of the vacuum doors within milliseconds of accuracy so they don't accidentally hit the walls. And they also have to instantaneously rebalance that giant spinning rotor. Then the rocket is now traveling at 7,200 kilometers an hour, or about 6 times the speed of sound, at sea level, which will induce a lot of heat, and it'll also slow the rocket down before it eventually gets out of the atmosphere, and then it has to light its own engine to continue into orbit. The company seems confident they've solved all these problems and will have a system that can deliver meaningful payloads into orbit at a fraction of the cost of a traditional launch system. If you want to learn more about spin launch, may I suggest watching Real Engineering's amazing video that dives really deep into their concept and tours their facilities. As with all Real Engineering videos, it's fantastic. But what if we didn't want the ground launch system to do as much of the work? What if we just want to do a little bit of a boost? And what if we wanted to also be able to help launch humans into orbit? Would that be feasible? Okay, let's go over a few of these ideas. To keep these concepts reliable and safe, we're going to light the rocket's engines on the ground like what's conventional and preferred, and just use the launch assist to add to the acceleration of the engines. Trying to light a rocket while it's in free fall is one of those challenges we discussed in my other video about air launching. A common problem with dropping a rocket and then lighting it is it can lead to a complete mission failure if there's a problem lighting the engines. Conventional rockets light their engines while still on the ground, and then once the computers confirm everything's good to go, then the ground system will let go of the rocket. This idea has saved countless rockets from a premature demise. Now, of course, there are some submarine launches and nuclear silos that will yeet and then light the engines, but it's probably just not that practical or safe, nor is it actually the most advantageous as far as performance goes on an orbital launcher. For these calculations, I'm putting the numbers into this spreadsheet I made, and then I'm using launchcalculator.com to help give us some baseline and easy calculations on the improvement with and without a launch system. Okay, these numbers aren't going to be perfect, so don't plan your mission around them, but again, they're going to be good enough to compare with and without a launch assist system, so at least, they'll be accurate like on a percentage basis. So don't take these numbers as pure gospel, but I think the point will still stand. So for our first idea, let's just take a Falcon 9 in reusable mode with a payload that weighs about 17,500 kilograms, which is roughly its current peak capacity while still being able to land the booster downrange. And then we'll see how much extra mass we can add to the payload if we actually help boost it off the ground. Let's start off as simple as we possibly can. Let's imagine the strong back that holds onto the rocket while it's vertical is turned into some kind of Maglev catapult thing that can hold onto the rocket and boost it up the length of the strong back, we'll say about 70 meters. Let's build a system that will have a total average net acceleration of 3 Gs, which is actually a pretty good amount of acceleration at liftoff, considering most orbital rockets accelerate with as low as about 0.1 net G. Most are usually more around 0.4 or 0.5 net Gs of acceleration. However, even with humans on board, rockets are often accelerating closer to 4 or 5 Gs close to engine cutoff. So 3 Gs is just a good starting point for an initial yeet. And notice I'm saying net acceleration. That's the amount of acceleration beyond the Earth's 9.8 meters per second squared. So when a rocket is lifting off directly opposing gravity, the first G of potential acceleration is basically eaten away by Earth's gravity. So while sitting on the ground, a G meter would read 1 G. And at liftoff, anything beyond 1 G would be net acceleration. So if a rocket has a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.5 to 1, it would have a net acceleration of 0.5 G. A Falcon 9 on its own reaches about 23 meters per second by the time it clears the tower. When boosted by the tower, it would add an additional 41 meters per second of velocity. So how much payload does about 41 meters per second of extra velocity equate to? It adds about 300 kilograms of additional payload capacity, raising our total to about 17,800 kilograms for a reusable Falcon 9. I mean, this sounds pretty good. 300 extra kilograms? So what would it actually take to do something like this? Well, the biggest issue here is how much energy it actually takes to accelerate an object as heavy as a rocket. The Falcon 9 is over 500 tons. It's like 550 tons when it's fully fueled. Let's figure out how much energy our assist system will need to have in order to accelerate a 550,000 kilogram rocket at a net 3G of acceleration. So first, we need to figure out how much work the rocket is doing and how much work the assist system needs to do. So if we're aiming for 3G of net acceleration, we have to add 1G because of gravity that we also have to overcome. So it's 4G worth of force we need to apply to the rocket. The rocket will provide 1.4G worth of accelerating force, so our assist system needs to provide 2.6 G's worth. To solve for force, we just need to take mass times acceleration. If the assist is pushing at 2.6 G's, we take that times 9.81 meters per second squared to get 25.5 meters per second squared. And then we need to multiply that times 550,000 kilograms, and we get 14 meganewtons of force. Now we need to convert that to kinetic energy by multiplying it by the distance we're accelerating it, so 70 meters, and we get an incredible 980 megajoules of energy. So even though the assist is only doing about 2/3 the amount of work, it's still almost 1,000 megajoules of energy. Okay, I have to admit, I have no context on how much energy that is. Is that a lot? Well, if we convert that to electrical energy, that would require about 270 kilowatt hours of battery capacity, which that's actually not that bad. You could store that amount of energy in 3 Tesla Model S batteries. So it's not like some absolutely absurd number. It's, certainly within reason. But what's a bit less reasonable is that we have to drain those 3 Tesla Model S batteries in only 2.15 seconds. Yikes. That's a power requirement of 450,000 kilowatts. Now, considering a Model S's peak output is about 800 kilowatts for the Plaid model, that's about 562 times the max power output of a Plaid Model S, which is a massive amount of power. Or another way to think about it, the average US home uses about 1,200 watts. So for those 2.15 seconds, you'd have to use about the same amount of electricity as 375,000 average US homes' power consumption. Or what if you ran it off Tesla superchargers, the chargers for EVs? Well, the average supercharger peaks at 250 kilowatts. So you need to plug in 1,800 Tesla superchargers to run this system. Now, of course, you could probably develop, hundreds of smaller battery packs or use something a lot more fitting like a supercapacitor that could reach the output and capacity. But the point is, it's a ridiculous amount of energy to release in just 2.18 seconds. But another really big problem here is that the strong back usually either reclines or falls back to get out of the way of the destructive rocket exhaust. So if the tower is now holding onto the rocket, it and all of its valuable magnets, wiring, motors, and plumbing are just going to get absolutely torched. And again, we could yeet, then light the engines, but we add a lot of risk. We add essentially a 0G engine ignition, and we lose performance because for every second it's not accelerating, it's losing velocity to gravity. So despite looking super cool, it's just not a good option here. Okay, maybe the Falcon 9 isn't the right platform for this, and we're doing all this extra work and engineering and all this extra complication for just 300 kilogram increase. That's only about a 1.7% increase in payload capacity. Why don't we try this again with Starship, since its stage 0 launch pad already has big chopstick lifting arms? Maybe we could just give them way more power and have them help boost the rocket off the ground. And now, since the tower is generally clear from the brunt of the exhaust, we can try and lift the rocket with less fear of having to rebuild our Maglev system every single launch. So let's crunch the numbers on this one. Just to keep this simple, let's just imagine we've engineered a way to utilize the full 140 meter tower, so we have more room to accelerate and keep our equations nice and easy. So thanks to the taller tower, we actually gain about 54 meters per second of additional velocity. So what's this do for our payload capacity? Well, assuming Starship can someday theoretically put 150 tons into orbit, let's just use that for our equations. Now, with an additional boost of 54 meters per second, it could lift closer to 155 tons. That's 5 extra tons of payload, which is about a 3% increase. Okay, so what's the math here? How much energy are we talking about? Well, first things first, the full stack of Starship is massive. It's almost 10 times the weight of Falcon 9 at about 5,000 tons. Yeah, that's extremely heavy. However, it does have a little bit higher thrust to weight ratio than the Falcon 9 at 1.5 to 1 versus the Falcon 9's 1.4 to 1. So our tower has to do proportionally a little less work to hit the same target of 3g of net acceleration. So now the tower needs to do 2.5 g's worth of accelerating force, and if we convert that to meganewtons and then multiply it by the 140 meters of the tower, we will figure out our kinetic energy, which is a whopping 17,080 megajoules, which converts to almost 5,000 kilowatt hours of electrical energy in order to accelerate the 5,000-ton Starship along with its engines for 3g of net acceleration. So now we need to use about 20 times the amount of energy as before. So as if needing to discharge 273 kilowatt hours in 2.15 seconds wasn't hard enough, now we need to discharge almost 5,000 kilowatt hours in about 3.1 seconds. That's over 5.5 million kilowatts, or in other words, 5.5 gigawatts of power for 3.1 seconds. So you need to basically plug the launch tower into 6 average-sized nuclear power plants and utilize all their output in order to provide that much electricity. That's an absurd amount of energy. Or again, we could and should probably use some huge capacitors for something like this, since they're great at storing energy for a shorter period of time and can have extremely high discharge rates. You could do something like this. Here's a 50 megajoule capacitor bank. Well, this is actually only about 10 bays of a 384 bay system capable of that 50 megajoule bank. So you'd actually need about 130,000 times what you actually see on screen right now. Just imagine all that wiring and the weight and the cost of it all, and the chance that a high voltage wire could get fried by the exhaust and end up arcing. I mean, this is starting to sound like a really bad idea for only a 3% gain in payload capacity. Okay, let's just scrap this whole electrical thing because it's just simply getting out of hand. What if instead we just use the chopsticks with a pulley system and a counterweight to help accelerate the rocket 3 Gs up the tower? To lift a 5,000-ton Starship full stack, adding 2.5 Gs to its existing thrust using a pulley and counterweight, the pulley would need a gear ratio of 5 to 1, and the counterweight requires a mass ratio of 35 to 1. So in other words, our counterweight would need to be 175 million kilograms. Let me say that again another way, 175,000 tons. For reference, an entire Gerald R. Ford class aircraft carrier, which is the largest aircraft carrier made, is about 100,000 metric tons. So you'd have to suspend almost 2 of the largest aircraft carriers ever made from the launch tower in order to have the right amount of mass to get the required potential energy in the system to produce 17,167 megajoules of uplifting force on the rocket, accelerating it to 3 Gs. Okay, now obviously an aircraft carrier isn't the most dense or affordable thing, so what if we just used regular old steel? Well, if we needed a 175,000 ton block of steel, it would be almost 22,000 cubic meters, which is a 28 by 28 by 28 meter cube. But even more ridiculous is that much steel alone is about $175 million worth of steel. Now, of course, we could shrink the cube by using over 15,000 cubic meters of lead for $350 million, or about 9,000 cubic meters of tungsten for about $4 billion. But you get the point. This isn't actually all that easy or cheap. And just imagine how big the pulley and the tower would need to be to support this kind of mass and forces. The tower would need to be so big and so beefy, I just can't even imagine what it'd take to build something capable of these loads and these forces. And let's not forget about the chopsticks. In order for the chopsticks to handle that kind of load, with that amount of acceleration, with that much leverage, just imagine how big and heavy they'd need to be. So now the tower needs to be even more massive, and the counterweight needs to also lift those arms too. And let's not forget the booster and Starship are normally lifted by these tiny ball mounts that again are only meant to support the weight of the drive vehicle. So you need some massive redesigns to lift it when it's fully fueled. You'd probably want to lift it down near the engine section, since that's where the force is already moving through the rocket. And let's not forget, we now have a 175,000 ton hunk of mass falling that needs to be slowed down before impacting the ground. So there's that consideration too. It all just gets absolutely absurd. Okay, so you'll notice that we're still doing all this at a fairly modest scale. So a fairly reasonable acceleration of only 3 Gs, and the launch system is adding acceleration to the rocket, not replacing it. You've noticed we've used existing launch tower sizes and just tried to make this whole thing as reasonable as possible. Despite this, the numbers are absolutely staggering. The scale of rockets and the forces involved are just ridiculous. It really does give you a perspective on how much power and energy those rocket engines are producing. Now, of course, you could scale this down, but considering all this is only getting you a 3% gain in payload capacity. What's the point? 3% gain. That's very little in the grand scheme of things to begin with, so if we scale it down even more, it becomes even more pointless. Well, perhaps we should scale this down, but let's scale everything down. Maybe doing this at Starship and Falcon 9 scale isn't the right idea. Maybe this would be more beneficial on a smaller rocket. Let's do another example. This time, let's look at engineering a Maglev vacuum tunnel launcher for Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. The Electron is much more feasible in terms of scale. It's only 18 meters tall, 1.2 meters wide, and is only about 13,000 kilograms when fully fueled. So let's go all out with this. Let's try and maximize the performance of an Electron with a mighty launch system. For this, let's make a 1 kilometer deep tunnel that has a Maglev sled capable of accelerating the Electron at 5 Gs the entire way. While it's in the tunnel, let's not have the rocket light its engines at all. We'll just let the Maglev give it a free boost. If you accelerate at 5 G over a full kilometer, it will take you just over 6 seconds, and you'd end up with a little over 300 meters per second of velocity. That's actually a pretty substantial head start for a rocket. That'd be more velocity than you'd receive doing an air launch, like what Virgin Orbit did with Launcher 1, and importantly, all of the momentum could be pointed in the right direction. The rocket wouldn't need to do any large change in heading like Launcher 1 had to do. So this whole system would actually require slightly less energy than our first Falcon 9 example. So thanks to the Electron's much lighter liftoff mass, this whole system requires only 177 kilowatt hours of electrical energy. And since it's draining that energy over 6.4 seconds, it required just shy of 100,000 kilowatts, which is much more manageable than some of our other examples. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's still a lot of electricity. It'd be about 400 superchargers worth of electricity to run this Maglev. So it's a lot, but it's almost feasible, kind of-ish. Now don't forget the vacuum portion is really only helpful to make the system more efficient when the rocket is accelerating along the track. Once the tunnel opens, the vacuum aspect doesn't matter at all, so whatever consideration it is to make it a vacuum only makes the system more efficient. It doesn't actually really add anything overall. In other words, a vacuum Maglev like this doesn't actually increase performance per se, but due to its low friction and low air resistance, it helps us get closer to these estimates that we've been calculating, since in the real world you'd experience pretty significant losses. I mean, this is maybe the most feasible option, but now the big question. All of this crazy infrastructure, added risk of pumping about 100 megawatts of electricity alongside your fully fueled rocket that's accelerating on a sled at 5 Gs inside a vacuum sealed tunnel? And then you better pray all 9 Rutherford engines light at the top of the tunnel, or else you just threw a perfectly good Electron rocket. So all of this complication for a total of roughly a 25% increase in payload capacity from 300 kilograms to about 375 kilograms. And because it's only a 25% increase in payload capacity, if the infrastructure cost is now hundreds of millions of dollars, it could take hundreds or maybe even thousands of launches to actually see a return on investment. I think what Rocket Lab is currently trying to do is a much better idea. They've found a way to increase their launch capacity by about 5,000%. Wait, what? Yeah, Rocket Lab is working on their Neutron rocket, which is simply a bigger rocket. With its development cost being around $500 million, it might even be cheaper than building a 1 kilometer deep vacuum tunnel Maglev launcher thing. So a 25% increase or a 5,000% increase? Which would you choose? So at the end of the day, simply scaling up a rocket seems to always be the much easier solution. Okay, let's go all out. What if we tried to eliminate the rocket altogether? Building a launch system that doesn't primarily rely on a rocket and instead uses a maglev and/or a vacuum tube has been envisioned for decades. StarTram was one of the first versions of this idea in the 60s, and countless ideas like Maglifter, the Lofstrom Loop, or other concepts have been presented, but they never seem to come to fruition. All we get are renders. Speaking of renders, these are from a video by What About It, who just released a video about the top 5 craziest ways to get to space. And this is definitely one of the craziest ways in my opinion. So what would this actually look like in reality? Why aren't we seeing these systems built? So let's see, what would it take to launch a Crew Dragon capsule into orbit without a rocket at all, using only a giant vacuum tube maglev system? For this, let's just aim shy of orbital velocity at 7,500 meters per second, since we will need to do a few hundred meters per second circularization burn to actually get into orbit, which the Dragon could do with its Draco thrusters. Let's limit the G-forces to 5 Gs, since that's about the upper limit of what you should subject astronauts to for an extended period of time. How long would a tube need to be if you're accelerating at 5 Gs trying to reach a velocity of 7,500 meters per second? Well, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is this tunnel would easily be long enough to get above the majority of the atmosphere, so you could suck all the air out of the tube and then you wouldn't need a crazy mechanism for a seal on top because the top of the tube would basically already be in space. Side note, in case you're wondering, if you had a tube going all the way to space, no, the vacuum of space wouldn't suck all the air out. The reason the air gets thinner and thinner is because of the pressure gradient. If you put a tube around a column of air, the pressure gradient would remain the same. You just now have a tube around it. But if you sucked all the air out of the tube, it would remain in a vacuum, assuming the walls are strong enough. Okay, now the bad news. This tube would need to be 573 kilometers long. Yeah, nearly 600 kilometers of vacuum tube, and you'd want this tube to actually be nearly horizontal to the ground at exit to get it into orbit. So you'd have to have struts and a support system for a tube that's about 100 kilometers in altitude. This stuff just scales really poorly because as you continue to accelerate, each second you cover more and more and more distance. So towards the end of the tunnel's acceleration, you're screaming at over 7 kilometers each and every second. That's a lot of expensive tubing infrastructure. Okay, forget the pure absurdity of the structure of the tube and the support system of the maglev. How much energy is needed to accelerate a 12,500 kilogram spacecraft at 5G over a distance of almost 600 kilometers? Well, the total amount of energy it's a lot. 351,000 megajoules of energy. We're talking about almost 100,000 kilowatt hours of electrical energy, which means on average, we'd require 2.3 gigawatts of power. Although that's not quite as much as Yeeting Starship, we're requiring all that energy for about 2.5 minutes versus only a quick 3-second burst of energy. That's about the same amount of energy that a city of almost 2 million average US homes would use for the entire 2.5 minutes. Man, oh man, this probably isn't going to happen in our lifetime. Quick side note, you might be wondering how a 12,500 kilogram Dragon capsule can require anywhere near the amount of power to accelerate it as Yeeting a 5 million kilogram Starship. Well, first, let's take a look at how much kinetic energy our Yeet system would do. And wow, notice how much kinetic energy the Dragon requires to accelerate it all the way to 7,500 meters per second. Even its peak power output is closer than you might think to the peak power output required to yeet Starship just a little bit off the ground. How can this be? Well, the relationship between energy is velocity squared. So as an object speeds up, it requires more and more power to continue accelerating at a constant rate. So accelerating Dragon at 5G from 0 to 50 meters per second requires only about 15 kilowatts, while accelerating from 7,450 meters per second to 7,500 meters per second requires about 4.5 gigawatts of power. So this does not scale well for launching an object into orbit from Earth. But maybe there's one place and one situation and one example we haven't talked about that might actually be a decent application for a yeet system. The moon. Is the moon perhaps the perfect environment for a launch assist system? Since the moon only has 1/6 Earth's gravity and no atmosphere, it would actually be a much better place to try and use a ground-based launch system. But it still isn't quite as easy as you might think. To get into lunar orbit, you need about 1,750 meters per second. That's much less than getting into low Earth orbit, which was about 7,800 meters per second, like we just talked about a minute ago. And to get completely out of the moon's gravity well, you only need another roughly 630 meters per second of delta V. So a single 2,380 meters per second impulse could actually get you all the way back to Earth from the surface of the moon. And because the moon is tidally locked with the Earth, we could build a permanent track and it would stay aimed at the Earth. You could literally shoot payloads back to Earth without using any propellant, other than, of course, some minor course corrections to target a perfect reentry. Okay, so this is actually kind of cool. So let's run the numbers on this and see how much track would we need to yeet something from the surface of the moon back to the Earth. Well, here's the bad news again. Even if we accelerate at that same constant 5 Gs of acceleration, you need to accelerate for about 48.5 seconds. You'd end up covering a distance of almost 58 kilometers. So even for a moon launch system, the size of a project like this is simply staggering in terms of scale. But it's also still a monumental amount of energy. Even with just the Dragon capsule at 12,500 kilograms, it would require about 35,000 megajoules of energy, with an average power requirement of about 668,000 kilowatts. So it's still a staggering amount of infrastructure and energy. So it's probably not something we'll see launching humans back to Earth from the moon anytime soon. But perhaps it might scale better if you were just sending resources like helium-3 or lunar regolith at higher Gs. Launching a smaller payload reduces the energy required, and a higher acceleration would reduce the track length. I think this would be a lot better application. So yeah, it's still not in any way easy, but you could imagine a futuristic world where we're actively mining and transporting things to and from the moon so often that the investment in a moon-based accelerator might actually be feasible or desirable. So moral of the story is it all comes back to that not so exciting word, compromise. Okay, I think it's time we finally wrap this one up. So to summarize, I think the biggest takeaway for me is just an appreciation for how much energy a rocket produces and just how immense the forces are. And it's wild to think rockets produce gigawatts of power and they don't melt. It's absolutely insane. I think one of the biggest problems with a system like this, besides just obviously the sheer scale and cost and energy, is the fact that you really commit to a system by building such an immense infrastructure. If you want to scale up the vehicle or make it, a change to the system, well, now you have this massive investment in something that might become a huge bottleneck. But I get it. Rockets are really close to the edge of what's physically possible. So I understand why we are craving to find ways to try and help squeeze even more performance out of them, optimizing them as much as possible. I get questions about this stuff all the time. But when it comes down to it, the old KISS method, or keep it simple, stupid, like my dad used to say, is what will likely win out. At some point, building just a little bit bigger rocket is often much easier and much more feasible than building costly and complicated launch assist systems. Now that being said, once spaceflight is extremely common. Let's say things are being flown into orbit multiple times an hour, almost as common as airplanes. Perhaps large ground-based infrastructure would start to become more and more feasible and or worthwhile. So what would you do if you were building a launch system from scratch? Would you be building a traditional rocket, or would you be trying to maximize performance any way possible? Let me know your thoughts, or if you have any other questions in the comments below. Like always, I owe a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our mission directors listed right here. Head on over to patreon.com/everydayastronaut or become a YouTube member or a next subscriber, whatever's easiest for you if you want to support the work we do. And while you're online, don't forget you can check out our 1/100 scale model rockets that are all back in stock, or you could pick up a shirt like this, our orbital velocity shirt, which actually has like a cheat sheet down at the bottom of all different orbital velocities of different orbits. It also has puff paint, which I always forget to point out. Oh, and we also have 2 brand new colorways of the shirt, which are awesome. So if you want this super cool shirt or other cool stuff, head on over to everydayastronaut.com/shop. Thanks everybody, that's gonna do it for me. I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, bringing space down to Earth for everyday people.